Hi, everybody. Do you believe that truth is stranger than fiction? I do. That's why I say you can't make this stuff up. Now, I'm a person who believes in the power of story. The power of story to entertain, to inform, to challenge, and to open your heart and expand your worldview. What is your story? We all have a story to tell. My story is that I'm an 83-year-old woman who's lived in the same little town, Colquitt, Georgia, all my life. And yet, I've traveled the whole world. I've been on every continent except Antarctica. My husband and I have been married for 65 years. Imagine that. We have 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren, and counting. I've had an amazing career. I've been a social worker, an entrepreneur, an international volunteer, and a community organizer. Now, when I turned 80 and my husband turned 90, I decided that I was going to write a book and call it Dynamic Aging. I intend to live forever. So far, so good. And here I am standing on the stage at Georgia Tech doing a TED Talk. You can't make this stuff up. Now, I'm going to tell you some stories today. And all these stories are true, but as we say in Swamp Gravy, truth is stranger than fiction, and you can't make this stuff up. I didn't tell you about Swamp Gravy, though. That's my real claim to fame. I forgot about that. Swamp Gravy is Georgia's official folk life play. And we've been telling stories in Colquitt, Georgia for 25 years, and we are a national model for community development through the arts and culture. Now, the stories I'm going to tell you are true, like I said, and I'm going to tell you 4 stories. Stories that entertain, challenge, and open your heart and your worldview. My first story is a fun story, and it's the story of the Anglin brothers. Now, all of you are too young to ever have seen the movie Escape from the Rock, although it's on TV all the time. It's the Clint Eastwood movie about the Anglin brothers, who are said to be the only men to escape from Alcatraz. Now, they were born in Colquitt, Georgia. Would you believe that? They were poor, very poor sharecroppers, and they wanted a better life. They had champagne taste on a beer pocketbook, and they liked nice clothes and pretty women, or maybe they liked pretty clothes and not so nice women. Anyway, they were what we call real dirt road sports. Now, they turned to a life of crime, and when they turned to a life of crime, they got caught in Florida. And Florida decided to make honest men out of them by teaching them a trade. You never guess what trade they taught them. To be locksmiths. After that, there was not a jail that could hold them. Their mistake was robbing a federally insured bank in Alabama, and they got sent to Alcatraz. Now, Alcatraz was built to be escape-proof because it's on this island in San Francisco Bay, surrounded by water that's too cold and too swift to survive. Now, if you've seen the movie, you know how they dug through the walls in their cells and went into the ventilation system, and how they even made rafts out of rubber raincoats issued by the prison. Those were some kind of heavy rubber raincoats. But then there's always been a lot of controversy about whether they escaped or not. The museum at Alcatraz says there's no way they could have made it alive. But I saw a recent PBS documentary that said it's very possible that they made it to land. Now, their families have always said that they went to Mexico and lived to be very old men. Why, honey, they even came to their mother's funeral dressed in drag, and they sat practically in the lap of the FBI. You can't make this stuff up. My second story is one that continues to inspire me. It's about my friend Agnes, who is a nurse in an addiction center in Tallahassee, Florida. One day, the police came to inform her that her daughter and grandson had been brutally murdered by a man they were trying to help overcome his addiction. Agnes was heartbroken. She loved this daughter, but she loved this grandson more than life itself. For 8 years, she grieved and agonized and questioned why, the why of it all. Finally, she wrote to Leonard. The final insult was that he could not remember who she was. She railed at him, "How could you possibly not know that I am the mother and grandmother of the people that you killed?" And thus began a correspondence. And in the process, Agnes learned that Leonard was a young man who had been badly abused as a child, but a man of remarkable literary talent. And so together they wrote a book called Wildflowers in the Median. And in the process of writing the book, Agnes learned to forgive Leonard. And she has become a national advocate for restorative justice. Listen while you learn what Leonard found.
I remember my stepfather, would beat me, and he would beat me with extension cords and hangers and, pieces of wood and all kinds of stuff. And, after every beating, he would tell me, it hurt me more than it hurt you. And, I only did it because I love you. Which kind of, it communicated the wrong message to me about what love was. So for many years, I thought that love was supposed to hurt. And I hurt everyone that I loved. And I measured love by how much what it actually was and was not. And I met someone, and she gave me my first real insight into what love was, because she saw past my conditions and the fact that I was in prison with a life sentence for murder. And not only for murder, but for doing the worst kind of murder that a man can do, murdering a woman and a child. And it was Agnes, the mother and grandmother of Patricia and Chris, the woman and child that I murdered, who gave me my best lesson about love, because by all rights, she should hate me. But she didn't. And over the course of time and through the journey that we took, that's been pretty amazing. She gave me love, and She taught me what it was.
You can't make this stuff up. Now I want to tell you about this bracelet and this woman who had it made for me in Hong Kong of pearls from her dowry. I was on a trip to China and Tibet, and the last leg of my trip was in Hong Kong. When the Chow family learned that I would be visiting their city, they planned an elaborate dinner for me in a downtown hotel. They had me interviewed by the Red Cross and the local Chinese newspaper. I was treated like a visiting celebrity. But you have to go back 20 years to know why this was happening. In 1970, the women of my small Methodist church sent some money to Hong Kong to buy school supplies for refugee children. And Mr. Chow wrote us to thank us for the school supplies. And in the process of writing back and forth, I learned his story. Mr. Chow had been an important official in the government of Chiang Kai-shek, and when the Communist Red Army overran China, he had to flee with his wife and 8 children. From a life of wealth and prestige and power, they were reduced to living in cardboard shacks in the hills above Hong Kong. But the gift of the school supplies was not the reason they were treating me like royalty. It was because at some point in time in those years, I had sent them $25 to buy a radio. Never was a gift more appreciated, and now the children were all grown and successful, and they wanted to meet me and thank me in person for that radio. I found out that the radio was so important to them because it was their entertainment for their whole tar paper shack neighborhood, and it was their one contact with the outside world, especially their communist homeland. And so, when my time in Hong Kong was over, Mrs. Chow presented me with this bracelet. I was overwhelmed. Why would she give me such an expensive gift? These pearls are from her dowry. She lived in very modest circumstances. With tears in her eyes, she told me about her life as a refugee. With 8 children to provide for, they were often hungry and cold. They had no creature comforts. And she would get so depressed that she would just want to end it all, take her own life, and get out of this horrible circumstance. But then she would remember that somewhere halfway around the world there was somebody who cared, and cared enough to send them money for a radio. You can't make this stuff up. And she would take heart and find courage and go on to live another day. And she lived to be a very old woman. But that's not the end of the story. The newspaper wrote an article about the friendship that had lasted across the years and across the continents. And a television producer read the story, and he sent a film crew to Colquitt, Georgia, to do a documentary about this story. And hundreds of people in Hong Kong saw the cast of Swamp Gravy singing Amazing Grace and honoring the memory of Mr. C.S. Chow. I tell you, you can't make this stuff up. And lastly, I want to tell you a family story. One very cold, dark December morning, a few days after Christmas and just before the New Year, a man went to work at the local bank. He parked his truck at the back door and gathered his belongings. He had a file of paperwork that he'd taken home the night before and a container of scraps from Christmas dinner. There was turkey and dressing and ham and sweet potatoes and peas and butter beans and all the rest. And just as he reached down to put his key in the back door, a masked man stepped out of the shadows. He was holding a gun or a knife, who could remember which, and needless to say, the paperwork and the dog scraps went flying everywhere as the banker struggled to get his gun out of his pocket. Then, when that failed, they found themselves rolling around on the sidewalk. The robber soon realized that he was outmatched by a man twice his age in strength and will, and the robber got up and ran away. You can't make this up. I tell this story because that man is my husband. He's my superhero, and I tell you, if he had a chance to attack a bank robber with his bare hands today, at 93 years old, he would not hesitate to do it. Because I tell y'all, you can't make this stuff up. Now, do you have a story from your life that you want to be sure handed down to your grandchildren? Is it a story of challenge, of courage, of synchronicity, of triumph, of sacrifice? Remember the symbol that shows that whatever wisdom of the past must not be left behind, but must be taken into the future. You can't make this stuff up, y'all.